Gente, queria agradecer a todos vocês por estarem por aqui. Mais uma entrevista muito bacana aqui da nossa HR.Rocks Remote Conference de 2020. Hoje eu estou com o Claudio Pinkus, que é um empreendedor baseado em Nova York, que está na sua 6ª startup já e que é nosso colega de Y Combinator. A gente passou juntos pelo batch do inverno de 2018 lá, eles fazendo ferramentas para que developers, né, engenheiros de software sejam mais produtivos. O Claudio tem uma história incrível em tecnologia. A gente já conversou sobre algumas coisas aqui que vamos falar para vocês que são muito bacanas. Já vem trabalhando de maneira remota há muito tempo e escreveu um artigo muito bacana sobre transparência, principalmente agora nesses tempos de Covid-19, e que a gente achou muito bacana explorar aqui com vocês. Claudio, thank you so much for coming or for taking part in this. It's a big pleasure to talk to you and to, let's pass some of your experience over to our audience, which is probably living through such a crisis for the first time. I guess it's probably your first time as well in as big a crisis as this one, but even then, I think it's the first for most of our audience, like in many ways. We've been through some really calm waters recently, and I think your learnings are going to be awesome. If you can just take a little while to introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about your story and a trajectory, that would be amazing.
Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you. Yes, I was a batchmate of HR.Rocks during winter 18. I still carry my W18 after my name in many meetings.
Me too.
There was a great experience. For me, that was the time when we were starting CodeStream. The story of CodeStream is a story of a very long relationship. In the year 1996, my partner Peter, this is the beginning of the web, started his first company. I was not part of it, but 3 other people were. And that company called Commissioner.com evolved, got sold to CBS Sports. Peter left CBS 2 or 3 years later and started a new company, a social network called Multiply, that was the original creator of the social newsfeed.
Really?
Yeah. Before this happened 2 years before Facebook had a social newsfeed. And as Peter was growing the company, I met him and I helped him in certain areas. I had just left Ask Jeeves, which was a search company where I was president. And
which for those of you who don't know was, I think it's fair to say it was the Google of the pre-Google era, right?
Yeah, I would say that's close. We were one of the top search engines in the world, and we sold the company in 2005 to IAC, another New York-based company. But kind of going back in time, I met Peter. We liked the interaction, so I joined Multiply. Eventually, we started the next company called Glip a few years later after we sold Multiply. And all of this thread from 96 to now is that we specialize in real-time communication for the purpose of creating better integration and better transparency. And we do it for different use cases. For developers is our latest example, but we did it for businesses. We did it before for fans of different kinds of sports. So,
really?
So the team has been together for over 25 years. It's the same team through 4 different startups.
There's one interesting thing you mentioned is I remember when I was at YC, I remember one of the first Masters of Scale episodes by Reid Hoffman. For those of you who don't know, it's a great interview podcast series. And he was interviewing Evan Williams, and the whole theme of the interview was how Evan was following such kind of a thread in his professional life, always starting companies around this idea of how you communicate what's inside your head. So there was Twitter, there was, I think, Blogger or something before Twitter, and then Medium. And I think what you said resonates with this story, because you're doing the same but for communication, right?
Correct. We're doing that same for particularly real-time communication, which we think is what we are now used to having as the most digestible type of interaction. We are now used, if this was 10 years ago, we would have said it's still email, but most businesses have moved from email when it comes to team communication, internal communication, to things like Slack and MS Teams and so forth. And we fit into that kind of modern view of communication.
That's very interesting.
So
yeah.
I was just going to say, you mentioned my article on transparency. I recently wrote a series of articles, 4 of them about COVID-19 and how to work in this type of environment and the implications. I think the 3rd article in the series was about transparency, and I put a lot of emphasis on what I believe to be as an essential new value that we need to bring to an all remote world. This trend that we're seeing right now, where everybody's working at home because we have no choice, will likely leave behind a lot of new ways of working. It's not that all of a sudden the pandemic will be over and everybody will walk back into the office. Many of us who find some value in working together remotely will want to still do that quite a bit of time, because there are very good reasons to do remote work. You have more flexibility, there is less pollution, you can spend more time with your family and so forth. But then you have to use the right tools and the right cultural values to make up for the lack of physical connections. And I believe that it is the culture of transparency, it is that value that you would bring to the company that begins the process of making sure that you are always thinking of how to be open at a minimum internally, and then secondarily externally, so that you will make everybody's view of you as a company, you as your values, your business, more aligned with your strategy. And that's the most essential part of, I think, transparency, the fact that it brings into the light your strategy for everybody to understand and implement.
It sounds, I think it's something we are trying to implement a bit more at HR.Rocks. And I think one interesting question that pops up in my mind is, where are the boundaries? So what are the limits to transparency? Where does transparency doesn't work, like in terms of subjects, or do you believe in like absolute transparency, such as, or more like closer to what probably Ray Dalio evangelizes about? What are your thoughts around the boundaries of transparency?
To start with, I think that there is an goal, is an aspiration. I think transparent companies do better. They do better for many different reasons, from having happier employees to having even higher profitability. And you can see study after study showing that a company that tends to be more transparent performs better. and there are many, we can go into the reasons for that, but it's a known fact. The question about what are the boundaries, first of all, depends on what industry you're in, what regulations affect you. There are many businesses, from insurance to banking to medical, to where privacy issues are a very important part of implementing your service, and the ability to trust that certain information will remain confidential and things like that, obviously are self-evident limits on transparency. But if you can set those aside and say, when it comes to how to find the right strategic alignment within your company, it's my belief that almost every company can benefit from it, but it's even more important as you are building the culture of the company. So small companies should almost always be very transparent. As you move up in scale, you need to find boundaries internally, because you cannot overwhelm your workforce with every little bit of information about 5,000 people. That that doesn't work. So, and ultimately, I think the most important aspect to transparency is that it cannot be forced on a company. Transparency is almost like leadership. If the person in charge of the company tends to be honest and open and clear and transparent about how the business is being conducted, it trickles down to the next level of management, and it then trickles down through the whole company. And if you believe in it, but you're not doing it, the company will never be transparent, because it is the openness of the leader that enables everybody else to follow. In that regard, I think examples like GitLab, one of our YC mates within the network, they are doing a phenomenal job at essentially showing everything that can be shown, from minutes to meetings and things like that, and they have it out in the open, because following kind of the same logic of the open source movement, they believe that if your customers and the employees all know the same information, everybody can make better decisions.
I think it's an interesting exercise. So one thing I do believe and I subscribe to that you said is that, you know, more transparency usually is better. Mm-hmm. And I like to think of you know, another correlated word that is context. So right. What I do try to ensure people give a lot of is context about what they're thinking, what they're deciding. And I think a lot of what, you know, is wrong with companies arises from people not knowing the why behind the decisions that are perfectly rational decisions, mm-hmm. but since they don't know the reasoning that went behind them, they start to create stories and maybe criticize as a way to just rebel against not knowing. But I was going to mention some rituals, and I think that could be an interesting tip to give to people, which is like, what if you were advising a fellow founder or a CEO as to how to become a bit more transparent? Where would you start?
Well, I would start by being very personal. I remember when this was many years ago, I went to an offsite with my company where I was a manager, and the CEO was about maybe 15 years older than me. This was not my first offsite. We were about 20 people in the management team, so it was a fairly sizable company, not huge, but sizable. And I remember the the CEO said, I like you to tell everybody we were around the fire a personal story that shaped your life. And each of us did, but the CEO had a wonderful story. And it was the story of how during the Second World War, the King of Denmark, when the Nazis decreed that every Jew had to walk out with a Star of David on their arm, the king was the first one to wear that and walk out in the street, and then everybody in Denmark did the same thing. It wasn't so much the story as it was that he started crying during the story. And it stayed with me that the first level of transparency is the human transparency. It's not the strategy. If I'm telling you something that is important to me and you understand it to be important to me, now we have a connection and we can move on to talking about other things. If the first thing I do is say, I need you all to understand that transparency is important, I've already lost you. So start by being open about yourself and conveying your values, what matters to you. It starts from there. After that, once you build a connection, you can start talking about other things when everybody understands what those values are.
I agree. I think it touches on vulnerability of the leader, and
absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful. I think trying, it's something I try to be very often, because it has bugged me in the past to see other leaders talk as if they didn't have insecurities, as if they didn't make mistakes, and I'm very open, even outside the company, but also inside the company, when I say that I don't know what I'm doing, that I'm trying my best, but I've never done this before. And also because like most of our team members are with me on that one. They also haven't done this before. They're being managers for the first time. We are big on these management, techniques and rituals and tools, all, of course, because that's what we cook. But it's interesting because being vulnerable is kind of counterintuitive, right?
Right.
Because most leaders think that as they become leaders, they have to be this persona that knows everything and that leads, the pack, and that's very interesting. I have one question for you that, well, not one, because I've already made several, but one thing that stuck with me is that you mentioned to me how you've been working remotely for the best part of the last 20 years.
That's right.
And one curiosity that arose was to ask you, how has remote work changed and not changed, since you started doing it, and even maybe why you did it, so early? Because I think 20 years ago, if nowadays it's becoming more mainstream, back then it was probably heretic. So it would be very interesting to learn a bit more about your journey with remote work.
Well, so for me, remote work started as a result of my first business, the one that failed. My first business was a localization company. I was very young and the computer industry was just starting, and I was studying computer science and I needed to support myself. So I found out that I could get a contract with some of the early players in the computer business. At first, just to localize software into my native language, which is Spanish. I'm from Argentina. So I was doing a little bit of that. But then they asked me, these early players, companies that are iconic, but they don't exist anymore, like Atari or Commodore, And they asked me, well, could you do this in 16 languages? So being an entrepreneur, I guess the answer is always yes. And what I found out is that I did not have a network of people who could do this locally. So I bought a bunch of microcomputers. This is before the IBM PC came out, okay? And
it's the Apple II era.
The Apple II era with the CPM and that operating system.
Yeah.
And I designed a program that allowed my translators to communicate with each other in that context, and also submit the translations directly into my typesetting system, because I had to deliver formatted galleys that came out of a photographic linotype.
Really?
So I had to design the interface and all that. And I had a network at that point of a good 40 different people working in different parts of the world, working through 1,200 baud modems, where you picked up the phone and you put it on top of it.
Really?
It was my first experience. But after that, as communication started getting faster and better, because most of the work that I was doing was then for my companies like Microsoft and Novell and so forth, we had to operate internationally. And our teams were distributed in different parts of the world. So we were always dealing with, how do we get something done? I'm sitting in Redmond working with Microsoft, but my team for, I don't know, Encarta is sitting in Spain. And all these things had to be always coordinated through management systems, and even the early stages of video conferencing, we were doing this all the time. So it always came naturally as a result of this, the nature of my business in the beginning. We were in many parts of the world, and we just had to operate geographically distributed. We had no choice.
This is amazing. And probably it was basically phone and real-time, like, collaboration on documents, right?
It was phone, real-time collaboration on document. And then when we grew a little bit, we managed to buy ourselves our own T1. So we actually had a connection between our offices in the US and our headquarters in Europe, which were in Dublin, Ireland, where we actually had enough speed that we could start doing things closer to real time, but it had to be our own private line.
Like a link, like one of these stock trading links.
Yeah, this was like outrageously expensive.
Yeah.
But that's how we started. Then as it evolved, I started working with Peter and so forth. At that point, communications were a lot cheaper. It was much easier to start operating on that basis. And when we sold Multiply, for instance, a social network that we worked on together, we already had offices in places like Jakarta and Manila and in Europe and in South Africa. And so once again, once you have the geographic distribution, it actually makes no sense to even be thinking about offices, because everybody has to work with everybody else. So it was always remote.
It's already kind of remote, right? I think companies don't realize, multinational companies don't realize how remote they are, doing like these 8 p.m. conference calls to get everybody around the world plugged in. So yeah, it's pretty much.
So in Multiply, we started it, and now with CodeStream, we actually don't even have an office. There's no reason for us to have one. Ultimately, we have a physical address in New York, but everybody's working from home because everything is as good as this, plus the tools that we have built to make all of these things even easier. So
yourselves, I think it's interesting because you guys are basically a product company, and you get to eat your own cooking, as we also do here at Culture.Rocks. So we like to think that's a great advantage, because almost everybody at Culture.Rocks uses Culture.Rocks, and almost everybody that works on product at CodeStream probably uses CodeStream to code. Right? Yeah, I think it plugs or it dovetails nicely into my last question for you, for us to wrap up, which is, what is CodeStream? How can you know, development teams gain from using your tools? And I've heard amazing things about it. So I think, you know, our audience can really gain from learning what you guys do.
Thank you for the question. I'll be happy to plug it. So also I'm wearing my CodeStream t-shirt. So yes,
that's very good. I have mine also, but it's below the fold here.
So CodeStream is a developer collaboration platform. And what it does is it brings all the activity around software development back into your IDE. The IDE is the editor where developers spend almost all of their time.
Their Word or their Google Docs.
Exactly right. So when a developer leaves their IDE to do something else, like go to Slack to communicate, or go to do a code review in GitHub, or go create an issue in Jira or in something like that, there is a bit of friction that's introduced by losing context. The editor is the best place where you have all the tools at your disposal to do whatever it is that you want to do. If you leave the editor and copy a block of code and paste it into Slack, you have to explain many different things about where it came from, and you've now introduced a level of friction that it doesn't really work very well for most of the communication. So the three elements that we bring into CodeStream are communication. So it integrates with things like Slack or Microsoft Teams or your own email. The second element that we bring in is integration with everything that you use normally in your development scenario. So we're connected to GitHub, we're connected to GitLab, Bitbucket, every issue tracker you can think of. And all of these things are now part of your working environment. So you no longer have to jump from one tool to the other to get work done. And the third element is transparency. And I stress this one is particularly interesting because it's a new addition. We only launched that a couple of weeks ago. What we do is, for the first time, CodeStream allows different developers that are using even different IDEs in their team to turn on the live view feature. And that means everybody on the team can see what you're working on. This is not the same as pair programming, where people are working together on a block of code. It's just a live view of, oh, you're working on that file, you've made some additions, you've made some deletions and so forth. If I'm working on the same file, I might want to talk to you because maybe we'll have a merge conflict if we don't. But even for a manager, if I see that Bob has been working on something for 3 hours and I thought it was supposed to take 15 minutes, I can, instead of waiting for Bob to be, who's embarrassed, come to me and say, I'm stuck, I can say, hey, Bob, I can't see what's going on here. Maybe you should just do this, it'll be fine. So for the first time in a software development environment, we give everybody, as well as managers, the ability to see what everybody's working on in real time. That level of transparency turns transparency into visibility, because transparency is a cultural value. Visibility is the implementation of a transparency value. So we bring that visibility to that environment. Finally, one of the things that CodeStream does better than just about anything else is lessen the burden of code reviews. Code reviews is something that every development team has to do.
I hear a lot of complaints around it.
Right. So we make the smoothest, easiest code review process because everything is in your IDE. You don't have to go anywhere else to do it. You have all the context, all your bindings, all of the environment that makes your IDE the right place for code now becomes the right place for a code review. And that cuts the code review time in half.
Really?
Yeah. It's an amazingly powerful implementation. People are loving it. And I strongly recommend that feature alone will just lower your anxiety and make everybody happier. It will make employees, developers collaborate better. It's pretty cool. We're very happy with it.
It's amazing because one of the themes we've been talking about of how, you know, remote work affects our lives is that, you know, it requires us to be more deliberate about what we do. And I think, you know, the transparency that happens, you know, by osmosis on an office, that you look at someone's monitor and you see what they're working on, you lose it by working remotely, and you're offering something similar, right?
We're bringing it back to the IDE and basically allowing people to say, I don't mind if you look at my work, just like if you were walking behind me in the office. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, that's amazing. Claudio, I wanted to thank you. This has been amazing, but much better than I expected. So it's very nice to re-meet you and to discuss these very relevant issues for our audience. Gente, eu queria agradecer todo mundo que assistiu o nosso papo. Foi muito bacana poder falar com o Claudio. Tem histórias muito bacanas da experiência dele. E também a experiência de primeira mão de como trabalhar nessa nova realidade de COVID-19. Muito obrigado pela audiência aqui do HR.Rocks. Vai ter muito mais coisa bacana, então fique ligado, fique ligada, que mais conteúdos vêm por aí. Muito obrigado, eu sou o Kiko e ficamos por aqui. Um abraço.
Muito obrigado a vocês.